Welcome back. Plans to hold a huge pro-Palestinian protest in central London on Armistice Day have been described as provocative and disrespectful by the Prime Minister, who says there's a clear and present risk that the cenotaph and other war memorials could be desecrated. Rishi Sunak has asked the Home Secretary to support the Met Police in doing everything necessary to protect the sanctity of Armistice Day and Remembrance Sunday. GB News has commissioned polling on the planned protest. It found that just 20% of people support the pro-Palestine protests during the Remembrance Day weekend. Almost half of those polls say that they would support banning the protests next weekend. Fewer than a third say that they have confidence in the police to manage marches across the United Kingdom. When asked about whether pro-Palestine marches are a threat to our values, 33% say that they are. And on the question of how they will vote at the next general election, 45% intend to back Labour. To discuss those findings, I'm joined by the co-founder and director of People Polling, Matt Goodwin. Matt, fairly strong feelings about the protest marches over Remembrance Weekend. And do you think that it's Remembrance Weekend which is the vital factor in that opinion?
I think that's part of the story, Michael. As you say, we've got 1 in 5 supporting the protests going ahead. We've got a much larger number, almost half the country, saying they think this march should be banned. I think partly this is about the conflict of values over remembrance and then on the other side showing solidarity with Palestine. But I think for many voters, particularly older voters, Conservatives, Brexit voters, working class voters, where the numbers are much higher in terms of the share saying, actually, I don't support this march, I'd like this march to be banned. I think what they feel, Michael, is a sense that their identity and their values, their sense of history, their sense of Britishness is now somehow under attack by these events.
So what was going on amongst younger voters in your poll?
Yeah, so 18 to 24s are interesting. I've already shown that they're the most likely group in British society to sympathise with the Palestinian side. They're also the least likely, by the way, to view Hamas as a terrorist group. In this particular poll, they are the most likely to say they support the protests, the least likely to say they would like the protests to be banned. And I've written before, Michael, I think what we're seeing really is partly the effect of a generation, Generation Z, who were born after the mid-1990s, who have basically come through the institutions, have come through schools, have come through the universities, really being surrounded by this identity politics view of the world, who instinctively will always side with minority groups that they perceive to be being oppressed or discriminated against, and sometimes, I think, lose sight of the wider national community and the majority. And this is one of the big divides in this poll, Michael, the generational divide. Younger voters much less concerned about this march than the over 50s, who, of course, are much more strongly connected to the events of World War II and remembrance.
Yes. I mean, of course, you have to make a decision as to what you regard as a minority. I mean, Israel is a very small country and it's surrounded by fairly hostile forces. Jews are quite a small minority in the world. So you're choosing a political position when you decide what is a minority, which is a minority with which you're going to have sympathy.
Exactly. And let's just be clear, in the world of identity politics, in the world of what we sometimes call woke ideology, the reality is that Jews are the wrong minority. They are seen as being the oppressors. They're seen as being dominant. And so what we've seen, particularly on the left of politics over the last few weeks, is really an expression of the extent to which identity politics has taken over, really, the narratives in our countries. Jews are the wrong group within this matrix. And so we are really not condemning Hamas, not expressing sympathy with Jews in Israel and British Jews to the extent that I and many other voters think we should be. And I've gone on record, Michael, I think the coverage of the conflict more generally, particularly in parts of established media, has been atrocious. And I think many British Jews out there are feeling lonely, discriminated against, and as if there's a double standard now in British society. And I just wanted to put on record that I think it's important somebody say publicly that's how they're feeling, and we should be showing them much more support.
Do you think the position in which Israel finds itself is partly that it is linked with the United Kingdom and with the United States, that broadly speaking, there's a part of leftism in the United States, in Britain and around the world, which doesn't like the United States and its policies, doesn't like the United Kingdom and its policies, and regards Israel as simply being an ally of those two. So not necessarily anti-Semitic, but kind of against the Western hegemony.
I think what we're seeing is a fusion of ideas and ideologies, actually, at the moment. I think if you look at Western societies, what we're seeing now is the rise of a toxic combination of radical Islamism, which has a strain of anti-Semitism running through the Middle East conflict and running through history. But I think we've also now got that colliding with the rise of this kind of woke identity politics on the left, which is enforcing this very simplistic binary view of the world, whereby there are simply oppressors and the oppressed, the dominant and the victims. And those two ideas are really colliding in quite a profound way. And what worries me more than anything, Michael, is that that is most visible in the elite institutions. I work in universities, and as we've seen over the last few weeks in North America particularly, it's the elite universities, it's the Harvards, it's the Oxfords, where I was giving a debate earlier this week, where students openly laughed when I described Hamas as a terrorist organisation. It's in the elite institutions where these ideologies have become especially embedded and have been colliding in quite a powerful way.
And you mentioned schools on the way through. What do you think is going on in schools?
Well, I'm deeply worried about what's happening in British schools. I think we have increasingly institutions imposing radical ideologies on children that often have no basis in science. Part of that is around the radical gender ideology, but with regards to this debate, it's also about critical race theory. It's a view that says the only interesting and significant thing about children is not their character, but is the colour of their skin, their fixed group identity, and maybe their gender identity as well. And we are importing, Michael, the same divisive ideologies from America, yet, as many writers have pointed out, Britain is not America. We have a fundamentally different history with issues around race and slavery and so forth. And I think when many parents are looking at what their children are being taught around some of these issues, around the Middle East conflict, around issues like gender and sex and so on, I think they're deeply concerned. And the one thing I would say is, these issues are often wrapped up as culture wars, and we use this phrase, culture wars. I just think it's very important that when we're talking about a country's history and identity, when we're talking about women's rights, when we're talking about the rights of children, these are not culture wars. These are the foundations of our civilization. And I think we should be very wary of people who simply lump all of this together as culture wars and say, well, we shouldn't talk about this. This is socially unacceptable. This isn't legitimate conversation, because many voters out there want to talk about these issues. They want to mark remembrance. They don't want to see these ideologies on the streets of Britain, and they don't want to see their institutions disrespected.
And very briefly, what did you find about voting intention, Conservative and Labour?
Well, on the current polls, Labour are still cruising to a Labour majority government next year. We've got a commanding double-digit lead for Labour. Remember, Keir Starmer and Labour need to be at least 12.5 points ahead in the polls for a majority. They're more than 20 points ahead. Rishi Sunak's big problem, Michael, and you'll know this from your experience in politics, is that he is only holding about half of those people who voted for Boris Johnson in 2019. The Conservatives have got to reconnect with their voters. I don't know how they do that, but that's a big task facing Rishi Sunak over the next year.